entertaining your questions and comments after class, but I'm on bus duty this week. So please don't feel slighted if I leave as soon as class is over, because my riders want to get home before it gets too late. So this week and next week, Lord willing, we'll save questions for later. We come tonight to the third and fourth Antiochuses, or Antiochuses, depending on where you put the emphasis. And we stopped a little bit early last time because we had sort of gotten to a point where I knew I didn't have enough time to get into Antiochus the third, and I didn't want to give him short shrift or get halfway through and have to stop. So we just stopped a little bit early. Antiochus the third is an interesting character. Now, he is the king that essentially saved the Seleucid Empire from dissolution. When he takes the throne at the age of 18, the empire is just about to crack up and fall apart. And if you think about, and I'm sorry I don't have slides this week, I flat just didn't have time to make them. But if I did, I'd give you a really good map right now of the Seleucid Empire, and you would see that it was massive in terms of land. I mean, it literally stretched from parts of Asia Minor all the way to parts of what today is India. And it covered a massive amount of land, and not only a massive amount of land, but a tremendous number of different groups of indigenous peoples. And so you had peoples of all different cultures, languages, religions, backgrounds throughout this empire that all had to be kept somewhat under control. And when Antiochus III comes to the throne, you have rebellions in the east. They have lost territory in Asia Minor. They're struggling to maintain much of anything relative to the Ptolemies down in Egypt. They're losing battles over in Greece. It seems like the wheels are coming off. But he was evidently a very wise and prudent ruler, because he manages to take control, put down a number of rebellions, weld everything back together into by the time he died, a strong empire. Now, here's another interesting tidbit. He was considered by most Jews to be a friend. He was quite on friendly relations with the Jews throughout his reign, and was really never looked on by most of the Jews as an enemy. Now, I say that, and let's pause there just a moment and discuss this, because among the Jews, you had a number of factions that are developing at this time. Now, Lord willing, we're going to dig into this a little bit deeper in future classes, but suffice it to say for now that there was always a group that said, we need to resist the influence of Greek culture, Greek thinking, and we need to emphasize studying the law of Moses and holding true to the things that make us distinctive as a people. And then there were, of course, always people who were ready to embrace whatever was new, whatever was exciting, whatever was sensational, whatever seemed like the intellectual thing to do, whatever seemed like the faddish thing to do. And so you had these schisms among the Jewish population, where you have some saying, look, we need to realize that these Greeks may be here among us and around us, and we may be subject to them and have to pay taxes to them, but we need to maintain our identity as Jews and primarily as God's chosen people. And in order to do that, we need to maintain a very strict adherence to the law of Moses. And then you had other people who are, they're adopting not only Greek language, but Greek patterns of thought. Some of which, of course, were perfectly innocuous. For example, the Greeks were bringing into these parts of the world what we know today as most of our mathematics, beyond basic arithmetic. Your algebras, your geometries, your trigonometries, these are being developed by the Greeks, some of whom are contemporary with this time period. For example, Ptolemy the first and second were patrons to Pythagoras. Do you remember in high school studying the Pythagorean theorem?
A square plus
You remember the
B
name?
square equals C squared.
If you are a carpenter, I bet you know and use the Pythagorean theorem. 3, 4, 5 triangle. You want to make sure something's square? Yeah. It's just part of the geometry that was being developed. And well, there's nothing inherently sinful or subversive about mathematics being developed. And so it was perfect. My math teacher over here is saying, that's right. Yeah, there's nothing inherently subversive or sinful about learning math. But what you have to understand is there were a great many of the Jewish people who didn't make the distinction between the sciences and the maths and the philosophical thoughts and some of the worldview ideas that were contrary to the law of Moses. And then the next step, of course, is the mythology and the worship and the ritual and all of those things that were part and parcel of Greek culture. Now, remember, the Greeks are the winners right now. They're dominating the globe, especially the part of the globe in which all of these Jews live, right? By virtue of being the winners, they're kind of the cool guys. And so their culture looks attractive. That's the culture of the people who are in control, the people who are the elites. And so you had a great many people who wanted political power among the Jews and saw a way to acquire that power by cozying up to the Greeks. How do you cozy up to the Greeks? Well, you do what they do. You go where they go. You spend time with them. You talk the way they talk. And so that's what began to happen. And you have these divisions in Jewish culture about this. You also have a set of divisions in Jewish culture between allegiance to the Ptolemies in Egypt and allegiance to the Seleucids in Syria. It was almost like, well, I guess it'd be all that terribly different than Republicans and Democrats in today's society. It was allegiance to a particular political group, more or less. And people who valued a particular set of issues tended to side with the Ptolemies, and people who valued a different set of issues tended to side with the Seleucids. Of course, the Ptolemies up until now have been the party in control of Judea. But of course, anybody who felt aggrieved by the Ptolemies was really wishing the Seleucids would run the Ptolemies out and take over, because it had to be better under the Seleucids than those old nasty Ptolemies. You know, and you had other people who thought, those Seleucids, have you seen what they've done in other places they control? Let's just be happy we've got the Ptolemies who leave us alone and pretty well let us self-govern and maintain our religion and do what we want to. So you had this political strife, and then you have the Hellenistic versus traditional strife going on. Well, in the midst of all this, Antiochus resettles 2,000 Jewish families from the region around Babylon into Lydia and Phrygia. Now, first of all, as far as I can tell, this was not a forcible resettlement. It was almost like the pioneers in the land grant. You know, go here, I will give you land, and I will give you resources and things of that nature. Now, the reason that's important for us, does anybody know where on the map roughly Lydia and Phrygia are located? Or are those just names that don't have a spot in your mind?
Isn't Phrygia around Turkey?
Yes, both of them are. Lydia is kind of central Turkey. Phrygia is sort of southwest Turkey. Okay, Turkey in our modern world, Asia Minor in their world. Now, why do I bring this up? Where did Paul do the vast majority of his missionary preaching? Wasn't it around Asia Minor? I know he went over into Greece, I understand that, but a lot of his work that's recorded in the book of Acts is done in Asia Minor. Where is the first place he goes in every new city that he visits?
Synagogue.
The synagogue. How did all these cities in Asia Minor that is not traditionally a Jewish homeland get synagogues? That's how. I mean, that's not the only reason, but that's a good foothold. He moves 2,000, not individuals, families into Asia Minor, settles them there, and what do? They bring Judaism with them, including the synagogues. And so when Paul gets there some years later, the first thing he finds is synagogues in every city which is a perfect place for him to go and preach the gospel, because these are supposed to be the folks that have the Old Testament background to recognize the Messiah. Okay? So he does that. Now, in 219 to 217, he goes to war with Ptolemy IV. Now, remember the original arrangement. When Seleucus I helped win the battle for the four generals, he was supposed to get Judea and Coelesyria, but he didn't. He didn't get it because Ptolemy I was already there, but they're friends. As a matter of fact, Seleucus originally got his start as a general under Ptolemy I, and Ptolemy I had done a lot to help his career along, and so they were on friendly terms. And even if Seleucus maybe didn't appreciate the fact that Ptolemy was on the land that he had been given as part of the settlement, he let him stay, and they didn't fight. The second generation, however, you begin to see some skirmishes. By the third generation, it's all out war. And here we are, Antiochus III goes to war with Ptolemy IV, and he's trying to take over Egypt. Why is he wanting to take over Egypt? Well,
riches and trade.
yeah. So there are a number of things. Number one, Alexandria is probably the most advanced city in the world at this point. Number two, Egypt is the other end of the trade route that begins, over in India, through Babylon, up over Syria, down through Judea. If you can control that entire trade route, taxes, levies, all sorts of things that you can do. Number three, Alexandria is an incredibly important port city on the Mediterranean. Now, there are port cities all up and down the coast of Palestine, but they don't control them either. They want to, because that's access to the sea. Number four, the Ptolemies had been for a long time considered the most prestigious of the four generals that were controlling the broken up Greek Empire. If you take over their land, you get all the prestige that goes with it, which includes not only the holdings of Egypt, but also the island of Cyprus. Somebody asked about Cyprus last week. The island of Cyprus, a good many lands around the western area of the coast of Asia Minor, the islands in between Asia Minor and the Greek peninsula itself. You get a foothold everywhere. And you're in a really fine position, if you choose to do so, to springboard a campaign to take over Greece. Now you've got the whole eastern half of the Mediterranean Sea. Okay? So it's strategically a gold mine. And so he goes to war with Ptolemy IV. Ptolemy defeats him at the Battle of Raphia. However, in 199, Ptolemy IV dies. His son, Ptolemy V, is an infant. And so he says, now's the time to strike. Egypt has an infant king, which means they have no real leadership. I can attack and I can take control of Egypt. And so he attacks again, but he loses the battle to a general by the name of Scopas. Scopas manages to hang on to mainland Egypt. And if Scopas would have stayed at home and kept what he had won, the way Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II, Ptolemy III had done, he probably could have kept Judea, but it doesn't. He pursues Antiochus all the way up to the sources of the Jordan River. It's actually above this map, but north of the Sea of Galilee, where the little streams, the little mountain streams, become the Jordan River. That's where they fight the Battle of Panion. And they fight this battle, and Antiochus III wins. Now you think to yourself, what is the big deal about defeating this army way up here when what you're trying to control is way down here? Scopas is the general of the Egyptian armies. He's not a general, he's the general. And when you defeat the general and his army, cut the head off the snake. Egypt is basically his for the taking. Or so he thinks. At least he gets Palestine, and Syria. And so he takes those, and this really marks the turning point. Up until 198 in the Battle of Panium, it's been the Ptolemies in control of Palestine. Now it's the Seleucids. Now again, Antiochus III is very friendly to the Jews, and so they're not especially upset at this change of control. He continues the policies that Ptolemy had extended to the Jews. You know, they're allowed to more or less self-govern as long as they pay their taxes. They're allowed to practice the law of Moses. They can keep the temple and the worship that they do. He's not going to interfere with any of that. Just, you know, don't cause trouble and pay your taxes. He's happy with you. And so they're pretty happy with that arrangement. In 192, he decides to invade Greece. Big mistake. Now he's ambitious, right? He's put this whole thing back together. He's basically got Egypt in a stranglehold, and he thinks, I'm going to take Greece. So he invades Greece. There's only one problem, and I'm not sure whether he understood this or not. Greece is not in fully Greek hands anymore. The Greek peninsula at this point has come under the protectorate of the Roman Empire. I said empire, it's not yet an empire, the Roman Republic. Okay? But Rome, nevertheless. Rome at this point has defeated Carthage, and Hannibal is in exile. You remember Hannibal, the great general of the Carthaginians who attacked Rome, leading the elephants over the Alps and all that good stuff? Hannibal? Guess where Hannibal went in exile? To the court of Antiochus III. Now, why do you suppose Antiochus decided to attack Greece? Probably because Hannibal's whispering in his ear, plotting and planning how's he going to overturn Rome. Well, one good way to do it would be to get a foothold in Greece, because Italy's the next peninsula over, right? And so you've got a foothold. Well, he tries it. He loses at the Battle of Thermopylae. But he doesn't just lose to the Greeks, he loses to the Romans. And that is going to be a real thorn in the side of the Seleucids from this point forward, because the Romans don't play. If you lose to the Romans, not only do they beat you, but they will ensure that they control you from this point forward. And so they do. They tell him that in order to settle this fight, he's going to have to agree to pay massive sums to the Romans in reparations for all the damage he's done, which probably is vastly overestimated, but hey, if you're the winner, you can set the terms, right? At any rate, he's going to have to pay these massive payments of reparations. He's going to have to send a member of his immediate family to be a hostage in Rome from this point onward. And anytime a new ruler succeeds to the throne, they're going to have to send a son or daughter to be a hostage in Rome. Why? Because that way Rome has your child in their custody, and they can sort of twist your ear. Okay? He's got all of these conditions. Well, he goes back under these conditions, having lost to Rome and having lost a great deal of respect. Well, he eventually dies in 187, and that's sort of the end of his rule. He leaves a legacy, though. Now, there's a little bit of a kerfuffle at his death, because there's a quick succession, 1, 2, and then all of a sudden, his son, Antiochus IV, comes to the throne. The only problem is Antiochus IV shouldn't have been in line for the throne. And a great many people considered him a usurper. He actually killed the one who was in line for the throne. Sound a little bit like the Wars of the Roses and all that sort of stuff. But at any rate, he sets a precedent with usurping the throne that's later going to prove to be the unraveling of the Seleucids. Because everybody, once somebody successfully usurps the throne, everybody else wants a shot at it, right? So he usurps the throne, and he gives himself this name, Epiphanes. Does anybody know what Epiphanes means?
Something about thought that God
brings you.
Right. It literally means an appearance of God.
Yeah.
And so the concept that he is conveying when he calls himself Epiphanes is, I am the appearance of God. Okay. Has anybody heard of the Roman Catholic observance of Epiphany? What is the event that they're commemorating on Epiphany? Anybody remember? Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's the appearance of the angel to Mary to tell her she's going to have a son. Is that right? So it's as though God has appeared to you, right? And that's what he's saying. I am the appearance of God. Now, he was considered an extravagant and generous ruler, but in a weird way. What I mean by that is he'd just be walking down the street and all of a sudden he'd reach into his pocket and just throw gold coins everywhere and just watch the peasants fight over them. Or he'd just pull out, I don't know what the ancient Greek equivalent of a chocolate cake was, but he'd pull out a chocolate cake and just give it to a total stranger. I mean, just kind of bizarre, weird things, but very extravagant, very generous gifts. And not only that, he supplemented the Seleucid army by hiring a whole bunch of Greek mercenaries. Now, what's the problem with hiring mercenaries?
No allegiance.
Someone else can hire for more. Yeah,
Law.
the highest bidder.
Okay. First of all, their loyalty is to the highest bidder. Okay, so they're dangerous. They're yours only as long as nobody else is offering them more money, right? But secondly is the little problem with money. You can't be an extravagant ruler and have a big mercenary army unless you've got a very significant cash flow somewhere. And as it turns out, he's wearing the people out with taxes to fund his very extravagant lifestyle and to pay for this mercenary army. Well, you can imagine that people talk. You know, why do you want to hire a mercenary army? All they've got to do is be bought off by someone else, and now they're turned against us, and they're here amongst us. They know all of our tactical plans and battle plans. They know what's fortified and what's not. They know where our supplies are. They know where our armies are stationed. They know where our cavalry is set up. All the ways to attack us, they're privy to all of that. You've just handed an enemy a gold coin, basically, if they decide to turn against us. So people begin to talk. That, coupled with his bizarre, odd behavior, caused some people to make a pun on his chosen name of Epiphanes and call him Epimenes. Anybody know what that means? The madman. Yes, the madman. So he was Antiochus IV madman instead of appearance of God to some people. But at any rate, he takes care to maintain good relations with Rome. He wants to, I mean, he's not stupid. He wants to be on the side of the people that are clearly powerful. And so he makes up some of those reparation payments that his father had let lapse. And he sends them, hostages so that he can say, hey, look, I'm being a good boy over here. You don't have to worry about me. Matter of fact, I'm your buddy. He wants to be on good terms with Rome. Well, in 170, so he's been on the throne 5 years now, Ptolemy VI comes to the throne and is a child. Ironically, and this is really one of the unexplained things, but ironically, he was appointed 2 guardians from among the slave class to be his guardians, and they essentially were acting as regents of Egypt at that time. Well, they send a demand to Antiochus IV and say, give us back Judea and Coelesyria. So how does he respond? He attacks Egypt. And he actually conquers Egypt as far as Libya, and then he goes back home. But he leaves on the throne the brother of Ptolemy VI as a puppet king. The only problem with leaving a Ptolemy as a puppet king is blood is thicker than water. And so it's not very long till Ptolemy VII reaches out to Ptolemy VI and says, hey, what if we band together against this madman up here and put Egypt back together? So they do. And so Antiochus goes 2 years later to attack again because he hears what they've done. only they're a little bit smarter than him. They've sent word to Rome. Now, Rome is heavily invested in this point in Egypt because Alexandria is one of Rome's major trading ports. Alexandria has become incredibly important at this point. And Rome doesn't want to see this loose cannon over there in Syria take over control of Alexandria, and then they've got to deal with him. And so they send an elderly Roman statesman by the name of Gaius Popilius Laenas. And he meets Antiochus as he's marching into Egypt. And he says, essentially, if you attack Egypt, you make war with Rome. I need a decision. And Antiochus, like any good politician, waffles and says, well, I'll have to confer with my advisors about that and get back to you. And Gaius Popilius takes a stick and draws a line in the sand around him and says, don't leave that circle until you give me a decision. Well, Antiochus knows which side his bread's buttered on, and he knows he doesn't want a war with Rome. And so he agrees not to attack Egypt. Now that was actually probably a good strategic decision for him, because just like every empire before him, attacking Egypt is a major, major commitment of resources, far away from home and hard to maintain. Nobody's ever successfully done it, except for Ptolemy. But at any rate, he goes back home. Now, put yourself in Antiochus' shoes. Are you a happy camper going back home? No, you've just been humiliated in front of your entire army, and you're the laughing stock of Egypt. I mean, an old man from Rome drew a circle around you, made you give him a decision, and sent you packing. So he's headed back home with his tail between his legs, as it were. And he may be like a petulant child who's looking for the cat to kick to take out his frustration. Not sure. Paul's there. Meanwhile, back at the ranch. Remember I told you in Palestine you had these schisms that are going on? Well, when Antiochus comes to the throne, the high priest is a man by the name of Jason. Does that strike anybody as odd that a high priest would be named Jason?
Very Greek name for
It is an incredibly Greek name. However, it's odd and it's not odd. It's odd from the perspective of you wouldn't expect a very Greek name to be the high priest of the Jews. It's not odd because the Hellenistic Jews have really gained a foothold among the upper echelon of Jewish society. And they have been courting the Seleucids' favor since Antiochus III. One way you can court their favor, of course, is to mimic them. Well, they say mimicry is not the word I'm looking for, but it's the sincerest form of flattery.
Imitation.
Yeah, imitation, thank you. And so he changes his name to Jason. I've forgotten now what his Hebrew name was, but he changes his name to Jason. He's high priest. But this fellow by the name of Menelaus, which is also, by the way, a very Greek name, Menelaus goes up to Antiochus' court and offers Antiochus more money than Jason offered him to put him in the high priest position. Now, think about where the high priest stands at this point in history. There is no king, right? They haven't had a king among the Jews since Zedekiah, if you count him. Jeconiah really was the last legitimate king that they had before the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. Here we are 400 years later. They haven't had a king. So who is the head of state de facto? It's the high priest. Okay? And so it's a very coveted position. Menelaus goes and bribes Antiochus to name him high priest. So Antiochus comes down there and deposes Jason and names Menelaus high priest. Anybody see a problem with that? I mean, do they hold elections and elect high priests in Judea? No. How does the high priest get to be high priest?
His descendant of Aaron.
Yeah, it's supposed to be in a line of direct descent from the seed of Aaron. And it's supposed to be the oldest living male direct descendant of Aaron who's qualified, right, to be high priest. Well, when you've got a political ruler who can come in and remove the high priest at will and replace him with his own candidate, what you essentially have is the political powers controlling the religious, right? Well, that's what's gone on. The only problem is, while he's down here in Egypt, being told you're not going to attack Egypt, a rumor gets back to Judea that he went down to Egypt and got killed. And that's all a certain number of Jews needed to hear, who did not like the idea of Menelaus being the high priest and being appointed by a political leader, and they run Menelaus out of town. Except for one little problem. Antiochus isn't dead. And he has to go right through Jerusalem on his way back home. And so he gets to Jerusalem and he finds it in an uproar, and his appointed high priest literally having been run out of town, and he massacres the Jews. I'm going to read you this quote real quick and then we'll close. This is from 2 Maccabees chapter 5 verses 11 through 14. When these happenings were reported to the king, speaking of Antiochus, he thought that Judea was in revolt. Raging like a wild animal, he sent out from Egypt and took Jerusalem by storm. He ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy those whom they met, and to slay those who took refuge in their houses. There was a massacre of young and old, a killing of women and children, a slaughter of virgins and infants. In the space of 3 days, 80,000 were lost, 40,000 meeting a violent death, and the same number being sold into slavery. So you have an all-out massacre in the city of Jerusalem. Now, on that cliffhanger, tune in next week and we'll tell you where it goes from there. Thank you for your attention.